Hello, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Hart. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm PFLAG National's Learning and Inclusion Manager. And I'm so excited to be with you all today. I'll be hanging out with you all in the comments for today's show, but I'm going to bring in my colleague, Jamie Hinkle, to get us started.
Hi, Mackenzie. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Jamie. How are you?
I'm good. We're taking on some new roles and responsibilities as a part of something to talk about live, so that's exciting.
Very exciting. Very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will see you soon if we have some questions from folks later in the broadcast.
Great. Thanks, Jamie.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Hinkle. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Interim Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. As we shift to this new monthly format for Something to Talk About Live, I will be playing the role of Jean Marie Nevada, who is getting settled over at Out and Equal. So let's get started. As many of you know, on June 30th, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its opinion on the 303 Creative case, ruling in favor of a website designer who claimed that Colorado's non discrimination laws were a violation of her right to free speech. What you might not know is that in the 6 weeks since then, stories about other businesses denying services to people who are LGBTQ plus, about people being fired because of who they are, and about other forms of discrimination have popped up across the country. This week, we're actually going to use an article from Slate by Hila Keren called Homophobic Business Owners Are Having a Field Day Since Last Month's Supreme Court Decision, which is going to just help us to understand 303 Creative's harmful and expanding impact right now. I'm honored to be joined today by CP Hoffman, who is the Senior Policy Counsel at the National Center for Trans Equality. And I'm really hoping to learn a great deal from our conversation. How are you, CP? It's nice to meet
I'm
you.
Oh, thanks. I'm doing well, and thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And could you do a little bit better job of introducing yourself and telling the audience about who you are and the kind of work that you do at NCTE?
Yeah, so I am part of NCTE's policy team. We have 4 of us that are working on federal and state policy, so it's a fairly small team. We do have a separate organizing team, which I want to shout out because they are amazing and they do a lot of the ground level work in states and with local organizations. So it isn't all on the 4 of us, but I have been leading NCTE's work in a variety of areas, including healthcare, digital media, which I just got off a fun call about, and identity documents, and then some other things. And also do a fair bit of general discrimination stuff. Before joining NCTE, which is, it stands for the National Center for Transgender Equality, for anyone who didn't hear that. We are the nation's leading organization that's focused exclusively on trans advocacy. We are based in Washington, D.C. This is our 20th year of being around. We were founded in 2003. And we try to improve the lives of trans folk at the state and federal level. And then also, you may have heard of us from our U.S. transgender survey, which we originally issued in 2015, and then late last year we did a new round of it. So folks out there may have participated in it in 2022. The results of the 2022 survey are not out yet, and I'm not allowed to be like, oh yeah, we expect them on X date, but hopefully it won't be too long. And I'm waiting for them just as much as all of you out there are. Before, I'm going to stop talking in a second, but I will just say before joining NCTE, I was at Free State Justice, which is Maryland's state-level LGBTQ org. And there I did, in addition to policy work, I also did some direct legal services stuff. So I may get into one of the cases that I worked on there about a wedding venue.
Yeah, that is wonderful. CP, thank you so much for sharing. And I was about to ask about the survey results because I know Mackenzie and I use that data in our work all the time. I also, in another life, would love to talk to you about all of your nerd street cred. because it seemed as if that was a big part of your bio when I was learning just a little bit more about who you are. So maybe on our After Dark show.
One of my favorite moments was at, I think it was Lavender Law last year, which is the National Conference for the LGBTQ Bar Association. And after a panel on identity documents, I had someone come up to me and was like, "Are you the same CP Hoffman who used to write about comics? I've read your stuff, if so." And I was like, that is me.
It's wonderful, absolutely. But that's not what we're here to talk about. And I know that there have been a few stories of 303 creatives expanding and sort of devastating impact that have made national news. Things like the salon owner in Michigan who really publicly posted that she's not going to be providing services to people who are non-binary, or the Indiana Supreme Court decision that ruled in favor of a Catholic high school that had fired a teacher for being in a same-sex marriage. Are you hearing other stories in the work that you do that aren't garnering that sort of national attention when it comes to the impact that 303 is having?
Yeah, so I will note that since we are not a direct services legal organization at NCTE, we don't have the same people reaching out to us for legal help. So a lot of people who this is happening to are going to Lambda Legal, ACLU, local state orgs, etc., or TILDEF, which is the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or TLC, the Trans Law Center. That said, we certainly have heard stories. We do track this news very carefully, but it's largely things that, the same things that we're seeing in the news. We're not necessarily getting the people who, are thinking about filing a complaint, coming to us in the same way.
Yeah, and do you mentioned a couple of organizations where people who are looking for that direct legal support might go. Do you have any other recommendations for people who are experiencing that sort of discrimination? Should they be reporting their stories? Is it to those sorts of organizations? Is it to the media? I mean, what would you recommend if you were somebody who said, I've been discriminated against, I've been denied service, I've been fired from my job, and I think that it is in part because of who I am?
So I will first say, and this is something that we say a lot in not just queer advocacy, but in a lot of other areas where discrimination and abuse and violence, it really takes a toll on you personally. And so if you think that coming forward with your story is going to help you and help others, then do so. But I don't think anyone has an obligation to do so, because if it's just going to traumatize you again, then you don't have to go through that, and I'm not asking you to do that. But if you do want to try to push that Overton window to be like, oh yeah, discrimination is bad, then yes, do talk to the media, do talk to some of the national or local legal groups, do file complaints with your state civil rights commissions. So if you're in Maryland, for instance, you can file a complaint with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. And most states have something it's called almost exactly the same. Like Colorado's is the Colorado Commission on Civil Rights, et cetera, et cetera. They're pretty much all the same. And they, will investigate the case. They might not always do something, but I will say that if nothing else, the hassle and the burden for a lot of organizations to have to go through responding, it's just some of the burden to them. It means they have to justify their discrimination in a way that it's on them rather than on you as the person being discriminated against.
I appreciate that, and I do think that re-traumatization and that emotional labor that goes into reporting in some ways, especially in this moment where you might be in danger of experiencing emotional or physical violence, you might be doxxed, there are all sorts of things. So I really appreciate that insight.
And I will also throw out that if the person or organization discriminating against you is a licensed professional, if it's a doctor, if it's a lawyer, if it's, and some states like a cosmetologist, like
Mhm.
you can complain to their licensing board that oversees them, because pretty much, in most states there are general non-discrimination provisions in like the professional licensing provisions. So, that's another route you can take.
Mhm.
It doesn't necessarily involve like, going to court.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Now, the article that we used as a part of, or to guide today's conversation, notes that an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom is using the 303 ruling to actually preemptively sue states and localities to challenge existing non-discrimination laws. Um, do you think that that could potentially be a winning legal strategy?
Well, the interesting thing here is, so I have lots of thoughts on 303 Creative itself. What
Yeah.
I will say is, given the conservative nature of the judiciary in a lot of places in this country, it's going to be a winning strategy, at least in the short term, in at least some places. Whether it's a long-term strategy, whether it's going to be effective as a long-term strategy is a much different question.
Mhm.
But it's very clear that, and Alliance Defending Freedom was the group that brought the 303 Creative case in the first place. It's very clear that they selectively picked the precise case they wanted to bring in order to get this decision. And if you look at the decision itself, it's actually incredibly narrow, in ways that I can get into in a moment. But they found a case that they could take to get this very narrow decision that they're going to claim means something far more than what the actual decision says. And in a lot of courts, they're going to be able to make winning arguments using that, at least in the short term. Again, once it gets up to the courts of appeals, it's another question. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, I'm really not going to predict anything there, because they're their own beast these days.
Yeah. Yeah, and in your opinion and in the work that you do and sort of the research and what you know is happening on the ground with some of your colleagues, do you think that there are places where people really are in sort of the most danger of losing protections right now?
So one of the things that's really frustrating at the moment is that when we're talking about federal laws, um, we really do need to distinguish. We do need to distinguish between state and federal laws. When we're
Mhm.
talking about federal laws, there's an ability for groups like ADF to bring cases wherever they want. And so you've seen in the past, 5-10 years, this huge upswing of cases filed in like a particular court in Texas,
Mhm.
where they know that by filing it in this one courthouse, that they have, a like 80% chance of the case being assigned to a particular judge who is one of the most conservative judges in the federal judiciary. And so, we've been seeing a whole host of, federal laws, federal regulations, like federal actions, like being enjoined, stopped, etc., by this one judge in Texas, who people are forum shopping to
Mhm.
like make sure that their cases get in front of him. So when we're talking about like federal law, I think that we're going to keep seeing that
Mhm.
we're going to keep seeing like forum shopping by conservative legal groups that selectively choose their venues, whether it's this court in Texas or whether it's other courts where there's conservative judges, and that they're going to take advantage of that to try to push the limits of 303 Creative and other cases against any federal regulations that are designed to protect the LGBTQ community. When we're talking about the state level, it's a bit different, because the states all have their own court systems, and then they're also all subject to like the federal court systems when it comes to constitutional issues. And so, depending on where the state is, it may have, even if it has like a conservative judiciary of its own, it may be subject to like, a more progressive federal judiciary. So in that way, just to give two examples, like, I'm a little less worried about, actions in West Virginia, which is under the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which also includes Virginia, Maryland, and I think North Carolina, than I am about like Tennessee, which is under the Sixth Circuit. And so, but that said, we definitely are seeing a number of states where there's a lot of hostility, especially to trans people in the past couple of years. And I mean, I could name them, but, we've had 20 states in the past 2 years that have passed legislation banning gender affirming care for minors.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of those same states are going to be the ones where there's a lot of judges that are willing to listen to radical expansions of 303 Creative.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the work that you're doing and that your colleagues are doing, do you see this sense or this anticipation that this 303 decision is going to expand beyond questions around sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression? Do you see big concern that we might start seeing businesses that are denying service based on race or gender or age, or whether somebody is an unwed mother or has been divorced or anything like that?
So I think first it's important to, and I know I said I would get back to this, but I think it's important that we talk about the limitations of the 303 case itself, and like a little bit of the background about how it got to the court in the form that it did. So I'm not going to get into the full background, where actually it seems that there's some real shadiness by the plaintiffs and the and 303 Creative, but with not quite as much fidelity to reality and the truth as you would hope in the legal system. But the way that the case made it to the Supreme Court, the plaintiff and the state of Colorado had agreed to like all of these stipulations, which are basically like statements of fact that so narrowed the case that it was basically like, well, the state of Colorado agreed that, this plaintiff, who had never made a wedding website, for profit, was going to, that the way that she made websites was individualized to every individual customer, that she made bespoke sites that were, themselves, types of speech, that, she included custom written things on all of these websites, etc. Now, I've made websites before, like back in the day, back before I was in queer advocacy, or before I became a lawyer, actually. And like, there's some, amount of creativity to it, but you also reuse a lot of templates. And wedding websites especially, like, you can go to the Knot, you can go to, any of a dozen websites, and you can see that they have all these templates that have created, and you just pick the one you want, and, and maybe you tweak it a little bit. And so the fact that like the state of Colorado agreed that, oh yes, you're creating this, very evocative, thing that comes out of your, emotional heart as an artist, when she'd never done so, and there was no proof she was going to do so. It created a situation where the court, when they looked at the case, they couldn't, question whether it was an issue of speech, because that was the defendant, the state of Colorado, had agreed to that.
Yeah.
They said, oh yes, this is creative speech. And so there's language in the decision that says, because this is creative speech that requires, like bespoke content, etc. This is different than a business just refusing like normal services, or just saying that Blacks aren't allowed, Jews need not apply, Irish can take a hike, whatever the sign says. So by the terms of the decision itself, I would say it's incredibly limited to situations that are just like creative, like in a genuine way. And so, if you're going in and if you're going into a hair salon and saying, I want my hair cut this way, that you've cut, a dozen other people's hair in the last week, and here's a photo of exactly what I want, like, that's not creative. Not as a diss to like hairstylists, because certainly, you can go into a hairstylist and be like, do magic with my hair.
Mm-hmm.
But that's different than like, I want it to look exactly like this. And that's different from going into a store and just wanting to buy something off the shelf. And so I am of the opinion, and many others are as well, that 303 Creative does not, by its own terms, open the gate to just blanket discrimination. That it creates like a narrow exception for genuinely creative speech. Now, that said, that is not what ADF is going to try to use. What it has been, and is going to try to be, trying to use it to argue.
Yeah.
So it's really a question of, at the end of the day, how much the Supreme Court is willing to stand by what they said in 303 Creative. And if they, say, this was a particular issue of speech that doesn't really apply to all these other things. And if that's the case, then it's, we won't see dramatic changes.
Yeah.
But if they do sort of, if it's instead, and this is what, a lot of advocates are worried about, if they instead take it as, the opening of the door, then, it becomes the worrying first step in, making broader discrimination legal. To get to your actual question about whether we'll see expanded discrimination against racial groups, religious groups, etc., my gut instinct is that there will be, that's where, if we see efforts along those lines and it goes to the Supreme Court, they would very strictly interpret 303 Creative.
Yeah.
They would be like, oh no, of course, like, just buying a cake or being employed, that's different. That isn't speech. But if it's a question of a queer person who wants to, do like, okay, so I had a case a few years ago. I mentioned this at the beginning. I had a case a few years ago when I was at Free State Justice, where our client she was part of a same-sex couple, and she went to a wedding venue and was like, oh, this is great, I love it. And the person who owned the venue was like, oh, which one of you is the bride? And they're like, we both are. And then she's like, oh, we don't do that here, we're good Christians. Now, I would say that a wedding venue that, just sort of, it's rental space, like they're not necessarily responsible for decorating it, etc. Like renting that space isn't a statement of speech in the same way that, actively creating content is. But, and if that went to the Supreme Court with a, interracial marriage, like, oh, we don't allow that here. I think the Supreme Court would say, no, that's not speech. It's clearly not. But if it gets to the Supreme Court with a, gay couple, a lesbian couple, then I'm not confident with the Supreme Court would do. Because there's a real sense that they're creating an exception for queerness.
Yeah.
And that's worrisome. Now, again, that's not in the decision itself. It's like the fears of advocates. It's, people sort of reading into what might they do next. But it's very much what we're seeing ADF and other organizations like it, litigating on right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate all of that insight, because it's really nuanced and complex, and it is easy to snowball and go down that hole of just like what could happen, what if, and I appreciate all that you shared. And we do like to wrap up every single show by talking about what people can do with what they've learned. And I noticed that immediately following the 303 decision, a lot of people were suggesting that allies could sort of test businesses. And if I was going to purchase a cake because it was my niece's birthday, I'd go in and say, well, it's for a same-sex wedding. If the business said, no thank you, then I would not buy a cake from there. I wouldn't spend my money with them. I'd go elsewhere, even though it was a cake for a 9-year-old's birthday party. What do you think of that idea? Are there other ways that allies and people and their families and their friends can elevate people who are doing good in this space and making sure they're voting with their dollars in whatever ways that they can?
Yeah, so that particular strategy, I think that it can work like at a certain scale. And in fact, like there's a long history, in housing discrimination, for instance, of when a Black couple goes to rent a apartment, and they're told, oh, there's no units available, and then they'll send in a white couple, who then will be like, oh yeah, here's all our available units. And so they do things like that to prove housing discrimination. I would generally say to leave it to the professionals in the space, who are better able to whether that's advocates, attorneys, individuals at state agencies tasked with like investigating discrimination, because they're going to be better able to create the sort of the situation that they can then use to to use as evidence. That said, where you do encounter like a discrimination like this, leave a review, leave a Yelp review, leave a Google review, and if where you encounter like a really affirming place, leave a review and talk that up. Because like by making that information available, you make it easier for the next person.
Yeah, and do you know of any other resources that people could look to if they were trying to make a decision, like I'm going to go to this bakery or that bakery, I'm going to go buy my groceries here or there? Do you know of resources that people could use to help make those choices?
There definitely are some, depending on where you are, there's a lot of like local queer and trans groups that have put together resources on like, this is an affirming like hair salon, or, this bakery is fantastic and does great work with like the queer community. So like check with your local community. When it comes to nationwide, I'm probably blanking on something, but I don't have a single site that's coming to my mind. But yeah, definitely check with your local groups, because often they have like their fingers on the pulse, like to a far greater extent.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of people will turn to the Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce or the NGLCC nationally if they're looking for some insights. But, CP, thank you so much for being with us. I know that you have had a very busy and stressful day, so I appreciate the time that you have given to us. I hope that maybe we can have you back sometime to talk about some nerd cred. We talk about queer nerddom quite a bit, video games, comics, all sorts of things. So
I would love it. Somehow when I guess it was before I started NCTE, it was during my second interview with NCTE. I don't even remember how I got into it, but they asked a question about like how I like what I do to like maintain like a balance in my life, and I mentioned playing vampire role-playing games, and then somehow half of the interview turned into talking about vampires. And I don't know exactly how that happened. I kind of blame my supervisor, Olivia, who definitely asked me follow-up questions just from my one statement. But we were feeding off of each other. The other people in the room also like got questions about vampires and were asking me about vampires. It was cray. So I would love to come in and talk to you about some nerdy shit at some point.
Yeah, love it. Well, thank you so much. Until next time, my friend. Thanks. All right. Well, thank you everybody for being with us for Something to Talk About Live. We will be back next month where we'll be talking about bi plus identities and celebrating the bi plus community. As a reminder, we are shifting from a weekly format to a monthly format, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you again soon on Something to Talk About Live.